Welcome, viewers and listeners, to another edition of CHP Talks. This one is a little different this week. I'm here with Tom Harris, Executive Director of the International Climate Science Coalition Canada. And we're here at the Canada Strong and Free Networking Conference in Ottawa. It's a collection mostly of Conservative Party members, but completely of conservative-minded people like us. With Christian Heritage Party of Canada has a booth here. And I met Tom a couple of years ago at a similar conference, and Tom is an expert on this whole concept of climate science and in debunking that. In fact, this week, we each published an article very similar, and a lot of the information I've gained from Tom, and it has to do with why are we demonizing CO2? Why are we allowing that to dictate the policies in this country and heading towards disaster economically and maybe environmentally as well? So first of all, Tom, you represent the International Climate Science Coalition Canada.
Yeah, that's right.
ICSC Canada. And how long has that organization been in existence?
Well, only for 3 years. The International Climate Science Coalition is the original group, which is mostly focused on the United States. It started in 2007. They brought me in as executive director in 2008, and I've been with them ever since. But we needed a nonprofit in Canada with a Canadian focus. And so along with Patrick Moore and a few others, we now have International Climate Science Coalition Canada.
Okay.
And it's exciting because we're a nonprofit focused on trying to make sensible climate and energy policy, which is a challenge in Canada because the politicians are so frightened of the woke progressives that even the conservatives, as I say in my Toronto Sun article, are promoting the climate scare through their use of language and policies that really don't make any sense.
Yeah, we heard today from Pierre Poilievre and others. There was a panel on net zero, what that means for us as Canadians. So first of all, you said 3 years you've been here.
Yeah.
And we've heard a lot about this net zero. What's wrong with the net zero approach? First of all, maybe you can tell our viewers and listeners that.
Yeah, for sure. Well, most of the thing they're trying to eliminate is carbon dioxide. In fact, when you say greenhouse gases, about 80% of the greenhouse gases that Canada emits, if you don't count water vapor, which of course is the biggest it's the biggest greenhouse gas, but if we don't count that, 80% of our emissions of greenhouse gases is carbon dioxide. So when they're talking about net zero greenhouse gas emissions, they're really talking about trying to zero out carbon dioxide. And I say dioxide on purpose because it's not carbon. Carbon is graphite or soot. It's a solid substance. Carbon forms more compounds than any other element. And carbon dioxide, of course, is beneficial. The one effect that NASA has been able to determine as a result of observing the Earth from space, as CO2 rises, we've seen a great increase in crop productivity, in greening of the planet. So CO2 is our friend. In fact, it's interesting that scientists who are experts in agriculture are hoping that CO2 doubles. Okay, because most of the plants in our environment evolved at a time when CO2 was much higher than today. We're at one of the lowest levels of CO2 in Earth's history. We're much closer to dangerously low levels at which plants start to die than we are to any higher upper limit.
Wow. So why is it, do you think, that conservatives and actually most politicians, but even Conservative Party politicians who maybe 10 years ago were concerned about this climate scare and whatever, but why have they now adopted the language of the Liberals and the climate alarmists?
Well, it seems as if the backroom strategists and communications experts have told them that they cannot get elected unless they have a strong climate plan to reduce carbon dioxide. Okay, now they're totally wrong on that. I mean, if you think back, Stephen Harper, when he was head of the Canadian Alliance, he called the Kyoto Protocol, and this is his exact quote, he called it a money-sucking socialist scheme. Okay, now he won a prime ministership. Donald Trump, of course, has been very outspoken, calling the whole thing a hoax,
Right.
and he won presidency. So their idea that you can't be honest, you can't
Right.
tell the truth and get elected is clearly wrong. In the session we just heard with the MP Suds, Jenna Suds, I think her name was, she was saying how we have to tell the truth, and I agree.
Yeah.
But they were talking all about this Bill C-50,
Okay.
just in transition, or
Yeah.
just transition.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Just as
But they didn't talk about the core reason for the whole bill being flawed. Okay, they talk about the impact of the bill. Okay, they talk about why we shouldn't do it to protect our energy, but they don't go to the core issue. The core issue, and you can read it right on the web when you check out C-50, the core issue is stopping climate change,
Yeah, right.
which is nuts. I mean, so if they want to really help Canada, they have to develop a strategy to eventually kill the climate scare, because the carbon tax, as they call it, it's really a tax on carbon dioxide, is just a symptom of the climate scare that threatens Canada.
Yeah.
So they have to work out a strategy. And you know, if people go to americaoutloud.com today, it'll be, I suppose, not on their homepage in a few days, but I have an article which lays out a strategy to go through. And the first thing you have to do is stop using the language of your enemy.
Right.
Okay. The progressive left have become very successful in designing language to support their causes
Right.
and to hurt our causes.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's not just about the climate.
Oh,
It
no,
has to do
it's
with
about all kinds of.
gender and abortion, everything
That's
else.
right.
Yeah,
So we
they-
have to stop using their language.
Exactly. So you and I agree, CO2 is not pollution. It's a natural beneficial gas,
Yeah.
part of our natural atmosphere.
That's right. When we give people mouth-to-mouth respiration to save their life,
Yeah,
we're not poisoning them. We're saving their life.
right. So what about other products of combustion? I mean, there's particulate
Yeah.
matter and whatever. Yeah. What do you have to say about?
Well, you have things like sulfur dioxide and nitrous oxide, nitric oxide as well. But the bottom line is that those are real pollutants, okay? And we've done an amazingly good job at actually handling those. You know, and I was in Los Angeles right after I left the Air Force in 1981. It was funny because I actually still had a gas mask from when
Okay.
I was in the Air Force.
Okay.
Because the supply clerk went through the list and said, "You don't have a gas mask." And I said, "Looks like a gas mask." Nope, you don't have a gas mask. So I had a gas mask in my back seat, and I was stuck in a traffic jam in 1981 in Los Angeles, and the horizon was brown. Okay, so I put on the gas mask.
Okay.
It was great, and nobody looked at me like I was crazy. But we've done a wonderful job at reducing real pollution. So Los Angeles and much of the world now, at least the Western world, is very, very clean. The amount of pollution that a car puts out now is something like 1/20th of as much real pollution, sulfur dioxide, nitrous oxide, you know, those kinds of things. So real pollutants are actually about 1/20th of a car, say, in the 1960s. So we've done a wonderful job at reducing real pollution. The trouble is they now classify, and you laugh at this, this is just so nutty. When Paul Martin was prime minister and Stephen Harper was in opposition, Paul Martin designated carbon dioxide as one of the substances to be listed on the list of toxic substances under the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, CEPA. And Stephen Harper railed about that. He said, "You've got lead and PCBs and asbestos and carbon dioxide." Now, the funny thing on the carbon dioxide is on the CEPA webpage, they had carbon dioxide and then they had in brackets, "This is not a toxic substance." And yet it was in the list of toxic substances. So they put it there so they could control it. The sad thing is when Harper became prime minister, he left it there.
Yeah.
So yeah, people have got to realize we've done a great job in pollution reduction, and where it's still a problem, we should work on it, but not CO2.
Yeah. So what about, this is kind of a side note, but what about methane? There's a lot of talk about methane and cows and those types of things.
For sure.
So where does that stand, and what is that? Does it have anything to do with real climate change?
Well, not really, because in fact, it's interesting. William Happer, who's a professor from Princeton University, who's one of the world's experts in radiation physics, he's actually written a number of papers based on their analysis and their experiments, which show that methane has even less impact than carbon dioxide. Wow. And in fact, if you saw a doubling of CO2 over the next, say, 75 years, we would see at most a 1 degree rise, according to his kind of calculations. Methane is even less. And even less than that is nitrous oxide, N2O, which comes from fertilizers and other sources. And, you know, that's the big threat actually to our food supply, because what they've done in the Netherlands is they're telling farmers they have to use a lot less nitrogen fertilizer to reduce the nitrous oxide. And of course, in the case of methane, they're saying you got to kill, you know, 30% of all your cows, because through flatulence, they emit methane. But methane is even less threatening than CO2, which is, of course, it's not threatening anyway.
Yeah.
So neither of those three gases, if you actually look at the spectrum of radiation, are any problem at all.
You know, I think it's funny they worry about cows and reducing the herds of cows. The North American plains used to be covered with millions of bison.
Yeah.
And in the pristine days before the European colonization.
Yeah.
And yet nobody talks about that. And there was no evidence of massive climate change as a result of
Well, and I know the conservatives have got to have enough courage to say that. It's sad because right now they're supporting the climate scare.
Yeah. What kind of economic damage is being done to Canada, Canadians, by the government's complicity, government and media's complicity in the CO2 alarmism?
Well, the main first result is carbon tax rising more and more and more and more and more. You know, we're going to end up paying more in tax when we buy gasoline, eventually, the way this is going, than we're actually paying for the product.
Yeah.
You know, so that's the first impact. And of course, that ripples all through the supply chain. Okay, it's not just that you pay more at the pump or you pay more for your natural gas to heat your home. You also pay more because the suppliers have to give the cost back to the consumer. Okay, the farmers growing the crops, you know, growing our food, they're using diesel fuel. They have to pay a carbon tax on various elements of it. I'm not sure of the exact details there, but the bottom line is that then it's shipped by truck, you know, to packaging factories, and of course the shopping center, the store has to keep their store warm and the products cold as necessary. So all through the supply chain, you see an impact of the climate carbon tax or the climate regulations. So that's one effect. One effect it's really sad, and this isn't economic, but this is more spiritual and moral, is that the climate scare people have allied themselves with the pro-abortion industry. And that is really sad, because what they think is this is one way to restrict world population. And they didn't want to admit that at first. The Sierra Club was interviewed by Tucker Carlson, and he said, why are you, the Sierra Club, supporting abortion? Like, what does that have to do with the environment? And at first he said, oh, it's women's rights and stuff. Tucker said, yeah, sure, you can argue that if you want, but why is a group like you supporting this? And just take a drink. He said, because there's too many people on the planet. He admitted it. And you know, Rod, there's a group called the Voluntary Human Extinction Movement. I don't know if you've heard of them, but they actually have a lot of members. And they think that humanity is a curse to the planet, and that if we can get rid of humanity, then the biosphere will flourish, you know? And it's so sad, because, I mean, if they just said we should all kill ourselves, then their movement would disappear overnight. But what they're saying is we should have no more children. And this is a very sinister part of the environmental movement. It's interesting that more and more we're hearing from different groups and media. Vogue magazine recently had a headline saying something like, the greatest act of environmental terrorism is having a child. You know, and they showed the graph of how much, you know, how much goods they consume and everything else. So yeah, throughout our whole society, the economics, and of course, the desire to keep our population low. I mean, Elon Musk makes the point that there's not enough people, especially in the younger generation, because they have to somehow keep the society running.
Well, our country of Canada, we do not replace our population adequately through birth. We're bringing people in through immigration in order to try to compensate for that, but it's not a natural growth.
No, for sure. Well, one thing I was hoping I could talk to you about just briefly is we were just sitting in a session on carbon tech, not taxes. It was a panel. And I wanted to see how many times they used language that supported the climate scare. Well, a total of, let's see, 7, 8, 9 times they called it a carbon tax. Of course, they should call it like an energy tax or a tax on carbon dioxide. 3 times carbon leakage, carbon trade, carbon pricing, carbon sinks, et cetera, carbon sequestration, carbon footprint, carbon.
Yeah.
It's crazy because, as we said at the beginning of the discussion, it's carbon dioxide.
Right.
And it's a benign substance. So stop calling it carbon. Now, of course, the reason the left want us to do that is because they think of it as something dirty, carbon. But the conservatives are supporting the climate scare, and that is completely crazy.
So I guess the question, language has been, as you know, continue, and it has been and continues to drive the public perception of climate and what we need to do to shift our society to a non-carbon consuming society.
Low carbon society.
So what do we have to do to reclaim the language and take that policy pressure off politicians?
Yeah, well, I think what they have to do is take a step back and say, look, our goal is not just to axe the tax or spike the hike. We want to kill the underlying problem that is the real disease.
Yeah.
I mean, the carbon tax is just a symptom of the disease. Yeah. The climate scare will ruin Canada economically and socially and energy security wise. We really, their goal should be to kill the climate scare. Yeah. But the strategists behind the scenes don't have that as a goal. They're just looking to get elected, first of all. And secondly, they're looking to get through the day with as little hassle as possible. But they haven't developed a long-term strategy. And they need a strategy if their ultimate goal is to do what's good for Canada and, quite frankly, for the environment. They need a long-term strategy, and that's what they're lacking. My America Out Loud article, and I'll send you a link to it so you can put it on your website, goes through a strategy which allows them to start redefining and rewording the debate.
Right.
You don't, it's funny, martial arts experts say you don't fight your opponent's fight, you fight your fight.
Okay.
But what the conservatives are doing is they are using the language of their enemy.
That's right.
And they are indirectly supporting the enemy. We're not going to have carbon taxes. We're going to have carbon tech. We're going to bury carbon dioxide underground, Which
is another cost to Canadians. Somehow we're going to figure out we're going to buy this technology. We're going to have people employed putting carbon underground. And
so they're not being serious. I mean, they have to recognize that the real goal should be killing the climate scare. And one of the strategies I would suggest is what Nancy Green-Rain, remember, she's the female athlete of the century. Right. She was a senator back in 2011 when Stephen Harper was prime minister. And she held a session in the Senate Committee on the Environment in which she invited in various experts from Carleton University, Ottawa U, Guelph University, who explained why the climate scare is wrong. Why it's not scientifically based, why in fact it is generally speaking a hoax. It is really, it is. It's a strange word. Yeah. And so she had these scientists explain that to the Senate. Now, sadly, the Harper government did not publicize that hearing. It was really too bad. We publicized it and we got about 30,000 views. So that's not bad. But what they should have done is they should have publicized the heck out of it. Yeah. And Harper, if he was cornered, could have said, well, I'm not a climate expert. I can't judge who's right, but I think the public deserve to hear more than one point of view. So that's what Pierre Poilievre should do. He should talk quietly to the Senate Conservative caucus and say, hey guys, will you bring in scientists who can defeat this or at least refute it? And then publicize the heck out of it. Yeah. And then after they publicized it, they then have to hold a national poll, and they should ask Canadians questions like, how much would you spend to reduce our carbon dioxide emissions so that we will lead the world in the fight to stop climate change? And also ask them, do you think that we have a crisis that is actually threatening our society so much we have to restructure our entire energy infrastructure? Mm-hmm. So I think that kind of a poll done in a non-biased way, done totally in a neutral way, would give Pierre Poilievre the strength and the courage to then say to the Liberal government, will you bring in scientists from all points of view, not just ones that agree with you,
Right.
but also the other side as well, and let the Canadian public hear the full range of opinion.
Exactly, yeah,
And then Pierre Poilievre, of course, what'll happen is Trudeau won't do it.
yeah,
Okay, so then Pierre Poilievre can step back and say, what is the Liberal government afraid of? They're afraid to let Canadians hear more than the point of view that agrees with them.
Right.
They can make real hay on that. Now, Pierre doesn't actually have to say that he thinks the climate scare is a hoax.
Yeah.
But what he can do is advocate for open, free dialogue. So they can do it much different to the way they're doing it.
So Tom Harris, his article in the Toronto Sun this week is conservative leaders must stop promoting the climate scare. And also this week, my article came out in the communique. Many viewers and listeners would have seen it. Axing the Tax is not enough. We must defend CO2. And
Perfect.
I thank Mr. Tom Harris for
Thank you.
sharing with us his expertise in this area. And please go and check out his website, ICSC-Canada.com.
Yeah, perfect.
There we go. All right. Thanks. Tune in next week for another edition of CHP Talks.